All right, while we wait for just a few minutes to actually start, this week we're going to be in Daniel 6, verses 10 to 24. So while we wait until right at 10 o'clock, if you go ahead and turn to Daniel 6, starting at 10, then you'll be ready for when we start. Sir. Just about one more minute, and like I said, we're in Daniel 6, verses 10 to 24 this morning. All right, we'll go ahead and start. Now, we've been reading about Daniel, and we've read how he interacted with the various rulers. And we also see in his life how, through it all, he remained focused on living for God rather than the circumstances of his life. So now, in chapter 6, this is what we're seeing. Daniel at this point has served at least 3 kings. He served King Nebuchadnezzar, King Belshazzar, and now he is serving Darius, the first king of the Persian Empire. Now remember, Daniel came when he was a young man, and so now he's probably very close to 80 years old when the events of chapter 6 take place. So when Darius took over, he appointed 120 officials called satraps to administer the kingdom. And he also chose 3 administrators, one of which was Daniel, to oversee the satraps. So in this hierarchy of power, we have the king, we have the 3 administrators, and then we have the 120. So, and so that's the background, because we're going to see that background plays into the upcoming law. So Daniel distinguished himself in service so well that the king considered appointing him over the entire kingdom, and that's in chapter 6, verse 3. So Daniel, even though he's in exile, even though he is not able to go to Jerusalem to worship, he's not able to do any of the things that a Jew would want to do, he still is worshiping God. And in that aspect of his life of worshiping God, God has blessed him, and he finds himself again working for now the 3rd ruler of this empire. So King Darius' favor towards Daniel did not please the other officials, but they could find no charge to bring against Daniel due to his trustworthiness. So that's in verse 4. So the problem lies, they can't accuse Daniel of anything because Daniel leads a godly life. So these people who are wanting to get rid of Daniel, because one, he's one of 3 that have power over the 120, and of course he is a foreigner, and he is given all this power. So what happens is they finally decided perhaps they could trap him with something regarding his relationship with God, and that's in verse 5. They suggested, now this is where they are going to get together and create a plot, a law that the king, they believe, will go ahead and approve. And then once it's approved in law, we'll see in the story, it can't be changed. And then that will be their way to get rid of Daniel, because they have nothing to accuse him of, but they know he has a firm relationship with God. So this is where this is going to happen. They suggested to the king that he had established a decree that for 30 days anyone who petitioned or prayed to any god or person besides the king would face death in a den of lions. And that's in verses 6 to 9. So they talk to the king, they convince him that you should put this into law. So the king signed the edict, which meant it couldn't be changed. So, and we'll see with the Persians that helped pass from passing too many frivolous laws, because everybody is going to be held to it, and it was their form of government. We see that in other places. So then, now we're going to go over today's stories before we go to the verses. Daniel learned about the edict, so he now knows what the edict says, but continued to pray to God 3 times a day as he's done before, and we'll see that in 10. Daniel's accusers found him doing so and informed King Darius that Daniel had disobeyed the king's edict, and that's when we get to 11 to 13. The king was displeased when he heard that he was unable to determine a way to rescue Daniel, and that's 14:15. So when we read the story, the king is not angry that Daniel is praying to God, because when we get further in, when he greets them at the cave, or at the lion's den, then it's evident that his worshiping God was not a secret. That was part of who Daniel was. And not only did the king know it, the previous kings knew it, and the 120 also knew it. It wasn't a secret. He wasn't a secret follower of a God. He openly followed God, and everyone knew it. So the king is displeased because he's been tricked into writing this edict, and now because of that, since he can't undo it, then the thought is that Daniel will forfeit his life because of it. At the king's order, Daniel is thrown into the lion den in verse 16. The king could not sleep that night and hurried to the lion's den at dawn and cried out, hoping to hear Daniel's voice, and that's in 18 to 20. So when we get to that part of the story, we know the king is angry, but not with Daniel. And we know the king is truly, he tried to get out of it. There is no way. He passed this edict. It has to be fulfilled. And so with that, we're going to see not only did he have a sleepless night, but we'll see what he did that night. And so when the king gets there, now remember, this is the king, the ruler of the entire empire. And he is getting up at dawn to see if the person he sentenced to death may have survived. And so this is a true, the king is doing it. He just didn't send messengers. He didn't wait to hear what the word was. He's going himself. So once he asked Daniel, when he cried out, Daniel replied that the angel had shut the lion's mouth in 21 and 22. The overjoyed king ordered and that's where we see overjoyed. Daniel lived. So the king wasn't mad at Daniel. The king we'll see what happens. He is mad though. The overjoyed king ordered Daniel's removal from the den, and Daniel was found unharmed, verse 23. Now that Daniel is unharmed, there's the consequence. The king then ordered Daniel's accusers and their families thrown into the den where they were killed. So after this, Darius sent word throughout the kingdom. Now, remember the first king did this too, that people should honor Daniel's God, who was able to do incredible wonders, including saving Daniel from the lions in 25 to 27. And then after his deliverance, Daniel continued serving in the Persian court. And so, as we get going on this story, then the thing that also keep in mind, it's just, in my mind, odd. The 3 leaders, the 3 kings, the current and the 2 previous, all knew Daniel followed God. He had a relationship. He worshiped God. He was going to obey God. They saw how God blessed Daniel through miraculous things, not just he's doing well, it's he is doing things that can only be attributed to God intervening. And yet, all three of them, two of them, here, we know the first one made an edict, the third one's making an edict about Daniel and God and about worshiping God. But it's not enough to know God exists, and it's not enough to see God do miracles. If it has no effect on you, then you're still the same person you were before you saw it all. So that's why we don't see any commentary in the scripture where, and then they stopped worshiping false gods and started worshiping the true God. We just don't see that. So even today, it's still possible. You can be confronted with God, but if it doesn't cause you to repent and change, then you're still the same person. It didn't have really any effect. So now that we're getting ready to start, remember, Daniel is close to 80 years old, and he lived his whole life away from his homeland. Daniel's focus is not on escape and return to Israel, but to continually serve God. He can obey God where he is, even though it's not his homeland, even though all these things are going on. And so, as we read the story, do we have the same commitment? Do we serve and trust God because of our relationship with God? And what do we allow in our environment to affect that? Hopefully nothing, because here we have Daniel drug off as a young man, spending his entire life outside of his country. And yet we see from the moment he entered the country until through now, his focus has been, how do I serve God in the way that God wants to be served? So starting in 10, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, now we talked about that, that's the edict, he went into his house. The windows in his upstairs room were open. And so if you're able to see within the room from another building, you would be able to see what Daniel's doing. So it's opened towards Jerusalem. So we know he still had a longing to return home. He wanted to go back to Jerusalem. He wanted to go back to where the temple would have been, and he's unable to. So he's upstairs in a room that is pointing towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to God, just as he had done before. So now we have this edict that says, if you pray to anybody but the king, you'll be thrown into a pit of lions. So at this point, we know that they learned it. That was the first opening statement. So Daniel was faced with a choice. Do I stop my worship of God for this month, or do I continue? And so he continued. And then when you see this, when he prayed and gave thanks to God. Now he is a captive in a foreign land. He's been there his whole life. There's an edict that says if you pray to God, anybody but the king, you're going to be thrown into a lion's pit. And he gave thanks to God. He's giving, because that's his relationship. His relationship with God is one of, he serves God outside of his situation. His situation doesn't determine his servitude. He serves God because that's his relationship, and the situation may have consequences. And he's already decided that the consequences of going to the lion's den will not prohibit him from worshiping God. And 11, then these men went as a group. Now that's probably, that's the people who have already instigated this law, because remember, they're looking for a way to trap Daniel. These men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. And so they found Daniel in prayer. And so, when we read this and we see Daniel's political enemies who are trying to have figured out a way to kill him, when they find Daniel, they find him exactly where Daniel should be, praying to God, petitioning God, imploring God. And so that's where they find him. Now, 12, now we're jumping forward a little bit. So they approach the king and ask about his edict. Now, before we read it, the king signed the edict. These are the same people who brought the edict before the king. So it's a rhetorical kind of statement. They know that the king remembers, and of course the king is going to remember. He made the law. So this is what they ask. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? So now that law that he just signed, the true purpose is about to be known. And so they're reminding him before they make you the accusation, they want the king to acknowledge this law, so that they're building it in steps. You as the king, remember you just said this. So this is what happens next. The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. So that order stands. Now, Persian law was unchangeable once the king enacted the edict. The Persians believed such a policy would ensure that king or leader did not play favorites or apply the law arbitrarily. The same situation appears in the book of Esther, where the king could not violate his decree to exterminate the Jews, though he did allow Esther and Mordecai to propose a successful counter decree, and that's in Esther 8:8. So in Daniel 6, Darius's pride led him to issue a decree that unwittingly trapped one of his most loyal servants. And so remember, this is the same Daniel who he was considering, he's one of the three, and we saw he was considering him making, like, you're going to be the one. You're going to be the whole person, not just one of the three over the 120. So the king, and we'll see his responses to this, but the king did not intend to kill Daniel. And so but the people who proposed the law did. 13, then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles. Now that's probably, one of the reasons they really don't like him. If you were put in power and just like today, the president gets into power and he has this wide group of people that he can appoint to different positions. And so the people he appoints are the people who were loyal to him in some fashion, either while he was running or for years and while he was running. But those appointees are appointed by the president. So here, the king obviously has had 3 at the top, and then 120 that he gave this position to. So these people obviously don't want Daniel around. They don't want him in that position anymore, and they address him as a Judean exile. So they're not talking about, hey, he's number 3 on your court or anything like that. This is a derogatory, a Judean exile. Then it goes on, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. And so now they're bringing to the king the law that they proposed, that he went with, he signed. They're showing the person that they've discovered who is violating the law, and they all know what has to happen next. So it looks like these group of people who have created the law are truly going to get rid of Daniel, because that was That would almost have, in a normal, God didn't intervene on somebody, then that's what truly would have happened. Now, in 14, as soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. And we'll see later his devotion to Daniel. He really liked Daniel. Daniel is the most trustworthy person. That's why they can't find anything to accuse him of. And so he's displeased because he's made this law because of at the request of these other people who brought it to him. So he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. So here we have the king who made this law that really, it made him feel good. It was pride, because nobody for a month could pray to anybody, man or God, except to the king. So he's like, I can go along with that. And he signed it. But when he did it, he didn't understand the implications, and he didn't understand the reasons that the other people wanted it. So he's made every effort as the king to rescuing Daniel, but there is no way out of this law. In 15, then these men went together to the king and said to him, and the king knows this too, but they're making sure he's aware. You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. And then we in 16, so now we're going to have the result of them coming again. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Now, this is not how the king, this next dialogue is not how the king, I'm sure, would normally act, because normally when you have prisoners or you have people that are executed, the king doesn't come and wish you good luck, right? That's and normally, you know, the king, unless you're probably a really vile person that was actually trying to kill the king, there were probably many executions. The king didn't go to them all. So here's what we have. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. Now, that says a tremendous amount about Daniel. And in your own life, I hope you look at your own life and ask, if you were being confronted for what you do, and the people doing it, would they acknowledge that you continually serve? Here, the king knows, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. And so, you know, when there's a thought, you know, my religion is private. You know, that I've heard people say that in the past, that they, you know, that they basically it's private between them and God, and it's not. It is a light to the world. Are the people around you seeing you and saying, he continue, or she will say they continually serve God, no matter what's going on, no matter what the king says, no matter what society says. Are you known for this? You continually serve God. So, and this is a great statement. His friends knew it, which is the king. His enemies knew it, which were the others who helped draft the law. So no matter who they were, if you knew Daniel, you knew he continually served the Lord. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Now, those signet rings, it was customary. They were kind of big because they're going to be detailed and ornate. And so when you would have a seal, like on a letter or something, you would pour the wax, and then the seal would go into it. And you would seal it in such a manner that it couldn't be opened without the wax seal being broke. And so with that, when they sealed that stone in a manner with the signet rings, and not the king did it. Now, if the king did it alone, of course, he could come back in a little while, have people roll the stone away, roll the stone back, reseal it, right? And you'd come the next day and it would look like the same unbroken seal. But that's not the case. The nobles also sealed it. And so those people are sealing it with the king. There's not going to be any way to break that seal and then get all the nobles to do it, because they're really the ones that want Daniel to die. So there's no opening that tomb, or that opening, without it showing it happened. 18. Then the king went into his palace, and okay, so he's gone back to his palace, and this is what a non-believer did because of his friendship with Daniel and the importance Daniel has in his kingdom, and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. And so that is showing us that when the king was angry, when we read it, he wasn't angry at Daniel. He was angry at himself and the people who helped him draft this edict. Because you don't spend the night fasting as a king for somebody who you don't care about, who blatantly broke your law. You don't spend it with no diversions, and he couldn't sleep because it was wearing on him. So Daniel's conduct was above reproach. The 120 knew his conduct was above reproach. However many of them were involved, we doesn't actually give a count, but we know no one had anything they could bring against Daniel. The king trusted him. The 120 had nothing. And so that's how they were going to have him killed. Now he's in the lion's den. Now we're jumping to, that was the end of 18. The night passes. Now we're at 19. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. So the king is rushing out to see. He's not waiting for word. He's waiting. The sentence has been fulfilled. Daniel has spent the night in the cave, or in the lion's den. The sentence is now fulfilled, and that he is going to go first thing to see the status. What has happened? When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. So we know that night of fasting, he didn't have any, they called it no diversions that night, no sleep. He is honestly overcome with some grief because of this law he passed and the consequences it has for Daniel. And that's why the first thing when he's crying out is he's crying out in anguish. Daniel. Now here's the accusers called him, let me go back. They called him, the Judean exile, remember? Mm-hmm. And so that's what his accusers call him. Now, when the king comes, he says, Daniel, servant of the living God. And so that is the title the king calls him, because he's also expecting. You don't call out without the expectation that somebody answers. And even though he's in anguish, he's still showing up with the expectation that somehow Daniel has lived. And then when we see servant of the living God, he does not worship, he being Daniel, does not worship an idol or a statue or something that is not alive. He is worshiping the living God. And the king is acknowledging that. If Daniel's worshiping the living God can act. And then, so he says, Daniel, the servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions. And so we have an acknowledgement of who he is. He is a servant of the living God. And then we have a comment on his character, Daniel's character. You continually serve, whom you continually serve. And so that is how he's calling out to Daniel, by acknowledging him by a title and by his character. Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. So when we have problems, and imagine, if you will, somebody that you have served impeccably. You have never done anything wrong. Everyone, even the people who don't like you, know they may not like you, but nobody can bring anything bad to say. And so when that person executes judgment to have you killed, the first thing you greet him with is, may the king live forever. Would that be your response? But Daniel can have such a response because he has a relationship with God. And in that relationship with God, he maintains a focus on worship and relationship, not on what all is happening in the kingdom, and the fact that now he's been thrown into prison. And it wasn't just prison, it was a den with lions. So he says, may the king live forever. And then we see, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. Now, before I get to the next one, so he answers the king back, and then he provides an explanation. My God, the God that Daniel worships, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. And so he is still down there with the lions. The lions aren't dead. He didn't overcome them through strength. There was no fight. There was nothing that Daniel did except rely on God. And he relied on God that whether he lived or died, he was still going to go into the pit of lions, the den. And here God has rescued him. And his next statement, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm. So it was God who protected Daniel. Daniel didn't fight the lions. It wasn't because of Daniel's physical prowess, especially at almost 80, that he was able to do it. The lions weren't already full from eating the last people, so they just didn't have time to get up and eat Daniel. It's none of those types of events. It wasn't through Daniel's effort, and it wasn't through the lion's lack of effort. That's what I'm getting at, that he survived. It was because of the hand of God, and we see an angel came and shut their mouth. The king was overjoyed. So we know the king is now is tremendously relieved. The Daniel that he knows, that's always been trustworthy, that he always has served God, is fine. So the king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found unharmed. Now, this is the question to ask yourself when things are going wrong. For he trusted in his God. And so, although Daniel will eventually die, and God saved him at this event because it also brought glory to God, to the Persian king, but his faith in God didn't just lie in, I have faith if things are going good. I have faith if my life's pretty good, I know God's blessing me. If my life's turning bad, well, maybe, did God turn away from me? Or no, that continual relationship, because we know God loves us, but it doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. And so here we see he was found unharmed, for he trusted in his God. Now, now that that edict and the law was fulfilled, and Daniel has lived anyway. And so now that the law has been fulfilled and Daniel is alive, the king is now once again free to act. The sentence was carried out. So in 24, the king then gave the command. Now, what is going to happen to those people who plotted against Daniel, against a person who they could find nothing wrong, and so they brought a law against him because they knew he worshiped God continually. So the king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. And now we have that 3E and that long hyphen. We're going to continue that thought. They, so the men who did it, their children, and their wives. So this punishment was not just one of, okay, the men did this, they turned against me, and they were trying to get rid of one of the three that obviously the king has a very fond relationship with. He is well respected. He does nothing wrong. And the king knows he worships God. And the king had an expectation that since he worshiped the living God, there was a good chance when he showed up in the morning, Daniel would be okay, which he was. So those people, he got rid of the men and their family, the children and the women. They were all put in. And this is what the next comment is. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So those who brought these accusations by creating a law to have Daniel killed, not only did they receive the same punishment, but the punishment extended to all of their family. There would be no one left. There would be no children to rise up to remember it, to challenge. There would be nobody. They all suffered this fate. So here's some things, my closing to think about. Daniel has worked for 3 kings while in exile. During that time, he never lost faith in God. So times change, kingdoms come and kingdoms go, and miraculously, we see Daniel as a key figure in each kingdom. And the norm is if you take over, you probably don't want those other people still there because they were loyal to the last king. Are they going to be loyal to me? Are they going to try and kill me in my sleep? So normally a new ruler would install a new group of leaders. But we see Daniel has been near the king for 3 kings. Daniel chose to focus on being obedient and to live for God. So remember, he's taken there as a young man. And he has spent, now he's close to 80. He spent his whole life there. But in his whole life, the character that they know him is, here's servant of the living God and whom you continually serve. So he is not the person that was trying to figure out how to get back to Jerusalem or Israel. He wasn't the person who was trying to like lead a revolt so the Jews could get out of the country. He was known because of his standing and character with God. Is that our focus today? Are you known because of your commitment to God and the fact that when the unsaved, these are all these people are the unsaved. They're not like today. They're not our church members that know you're saved. They're not our church family who says, well, I've seen him at church and this is the character I know him by. These are all the people who don't like him. This is the outside world, not the inside congregation that sees him, and he is known by his witness, and his witness is he continually serves God. And so, like I said, is that our focus today? And as the issues of the world occur, do we focus on trying to change our situation, or do we remain focused on serving God? Daniel was a young man, like I said, when he was taken away, and we see he worshiped God faithfully his entire life in spite of the situation he was in. The situation didn't dictate if he would be a adamant worshiper of God, if he would be faithful, if he would become known as a servant of the he was known as a servant. Oh, I just lost it. A servant of the living God. So do non-believers know that you are so committed to God that would be kind of how they know you? Oh, this person, we know he continually serves God. Even though they don't believe in God, even though the king isn't a follower, isn't somebody who is converted to Judaism at this time, they still had a title for Daniel, and that's how they knew him. So he worshiped God faithfully his whole life. And then my thought is Daniel kept his focus on God. Even when the edict came that, well, now if you worship God, you're going to die. He didn't try and figure out how to undo the edict. What he did is he continued his relationship in spite of what the king said, in spite of the law. He was well aware of the law, and he still went home and prayed 3 times a day because that's what the accusers brought. So I think the world has always been a problem, and it always will be. And there's always things going on. And there's always one new problem on the horizon that appears bigger than all the rest that we've had. And that is the way the world works. So just like Daniel, we haven't been drug off into a foreign country yet. We haven't been persecuted, and no one's writing laws that say if you worship God, we're not just going to kill you, we're going to put you in with lions so that it's a ferocious, terrible death. So without all that, do we still have a witness that says that we continually serve? And we don't even have all the turmoil that Daniel had, but do we still have a witness that says we continually serve? So as we have 2 more lessons in the book of Daniel, and as we look at those, just keep in mind as you hopefully are reading the whole book of Daniel, because we're just jumping through it, Daniel never lost hope. He wasn't hopeless. He was filled with hope, and he was prayed, and he was grateful, and his location and his situation didn't change his worship. So, David, if you'd close us in prayer.
Dear Lord, we thank you for allowing us to be in your house this morning to study this lesson of Daniel, who gives us a picture of how no matter what our circumstances are, it does not change our relationship with you. We can serve you in the good times and the bad times, and we should draw closer to you even more so in the bad times, so that our witness and our faith may be stronger, and we never know who we will be a witness to and who it may change to, Lord. We just pray that you will be with us as we go into the service this morning, and be with Brother John as he brings the message to the Lord. Be with us as we go out into our daily walk this week, that we may be a light for someone to see that they serve all the time, not just on Sunday and on Wednesday night. They are always a Christian and always a follower of Jesus. Pray that you will be with us as we go throughout this day. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
I bumped it. Oh, goodness. Okay, here we go.